The hospital room was quiet except for the steady beep of monitors and the soft rustle of starched fabric. Grace Mitchell stood beside the bed, her nurse's uniform crisp and blue, her blonde hair pulled back in a neat bun beneath her cap. In her hand, she held a pen poised over a clipboard. Though her fingers trembled slightly, the young man in the bed lay still. His dark hair swept back from a face that would have been handsome if it weren't so pale, so utterly exhausted. His eyes were closed, his breathing shallow. At 32, Christopher Hayes looked like a man who had already said goodbye to the world. Behind them, Dr. William Thornton stood with his hands clasped, his expression grave. Beside him, an elderly woman in pearls and an elegant cream suit watched with sharp, calculating eyes. Margaret Hayes, Christopher's grandmother, had the bearing of someone accustomed to getting exactly what she wanted. "Miss Mitchell," Margaret said, her voice crisp with authority, "I believe we've discussed the terms. My grandson has perhaps 3 months to live. The cancer has progressed beyond treatment. All we can offer now is comfort." Grace swallowed hard, looking down at the contract in her hands. 24 years old, drowning in her mother's medical debt, working double shifts just to keep the creditors at bay. And now this proposal, this impossible, heartbreaking proposal. "You want me to marry him?" Grace said quietly. "A dying man I've never met." "I want him to have peace in his final days," Margaret corrected, though her tone softened slightly. "Christopher has always been dutiful, always put the family business first. He never married, never had the chance to build a life of his own. I want him to have that experience, even if only for a short time. And in return, your mother's medical bills will be paid in full, plus a substantial sum for you." Grace looked at Christopher's face, at the shadows beneath his eyes, at the IV line running into his arm. 3 months, 90 days to play the role of a loving wife to a stranger, to watch him slip away, and then to carry that weight for the rest of her life. But her mother needed surgery. The bills were crushing her. And this man, this dying man, deserved some measure of comfort in his final chapter. "All right," she whispered. "I'll do it." The ceremony was simple, held right there in the hospital room with Dr. Thornton and Margaret as witnesses. Christopher was sedated, barely conscious, as Grace spoke her vows. She held his hand, surprised by its warmth, by the calluses that spoke of a life lived beyond boardrooms and balance sheets. When it was done, when the papers were signed and she wore a ring that felt impossibly heavy on her finger, Grace became Mrs. Christopher Hayes. She visited every day after that, spending her breaks and her off hours in his room. At first, she would simply sit and read to him, her voice soft in the quiet space. She read him poetry and adventure novels, the classics and contemporary fiction, anything that might reach him in whatever distant place he'd retreated to. Margaret had said Christopher had been a businessman, groomed from birth to take over the Hayes Corporation. But as Grace sat with him, learning the contours of his face, the way his breathing changed in sleep, she wondered who he really was beneath the expectations and the illness. On the 5th day, his eyes opened. Grace was reading Steinbeck when she noticed his gaze on her, brown eyes that held confusion and something else. Something like wonder. "You're real," he said, his voice hoarse from disuse. "I'm real," she confirmed, setting down the book. "I'm Grace, your wife." Christopher's brow furrowed. "My wife? But I don't remember." She explained it gently, the contract, his grandmother's wishes, the whole impossible situation. She expected anger or rejection, but Christopher just watched her with those thoughtful eyes. "You agreed to marry a dying man you'd never met," he said slowly. "Why?" Grace could have lied, could have made herself sound noble, but something about his direct gaze demanded honesty. "My mother needs surgery. I needed the money. Your grandmother made an offer I couldn't refuse." To her surprise, Christopher smiled, just a slight curve of his lips. "At least you're honest. That's more than most people in my life have ever been." From that day forward, they talked. Christopher was awake more often, though still weak, still tethered to machines and medications. He told her about his childhood, about a father who had died when Christopher was young, about being raised by Margaret to be the perfect heir. "I spent my whole life doing what was expected," he said one afternoon. "I went to the right schools, took the right job, made the right decisions for the company. But I never asked what I wanted, and now it's too late." "It's not too late," Grace said softly. You're still here. For how long? The question hung in the air between them. But something unexpected was happening. Christopher wasn't declining as rapidly as the doctors had predicted. The tumors that had been growing so aggressively seemed to have stabilized. Dr. Thornton was cautiously optimistic but warned against hope. Sometimes there's a plateau before the end, he said quietly. Don't mistake this for recovery. Grace didn't, but she also didn't waste the time they had. She brought him flowers from the hospital garden, smuggled in his favorite foods when he could eat, played music on her phone when the silence grew too heavy. Christopher, in turn, asked about her life. He wanted to know everything: her childhood in a small town upstate, her dreams of becoming a nurse, her mother's illness, her fears and hopes, and all the small details that made her who she was. You're remarkable, he said one evening, catching her hand. You know that? You're working yourself to exhaustion, caring for dying people every day, and you still have light in you. How do you do that? Grace looked at their joined hands. Someone told me once that we're all just walking each other home. Some journeys are longer than others, but we all need someone beside us. I guess I want to be that person. Weeks passed. Then months. Christopher grew stronger, not weaker. He began physical therapy, tentative at first, then with growing determination. The medical team was baffled. The tumors weren't just stable, they were shrinking. It's not possible, Dr. Thornton said, staring at the scans. But it's happening. Margaret came to visit, her sharp eyes taking in Christopher sitting up in bed, color in his cheeks, laughing at something Grace had said. You're getting better, Margaret said, her voice thick with emotion she rarely showed. I am, Christopher confirmed. The doctors are calling it a miracle. I think it might be simpler than that. I think I finally found something worth living for. His eyes were on Grace when he said it. But as Christopher's health improved, Grace felt a growing knot of anxiety. The contract had been for his final days, a marriage of convenience to give him comfort. Now that he was surviving, what did that mean for them? One afternoon, when they were alone, Christopher took her hand. Grace, I need to tell you something. I'm going to ask my lawyers to dissolve our marriage, give you your freedom back. Grace felt her heart crack. Oh, of course. That makes sense. Let me finish, Christopher said gently. I want to dissolve the contract marriage because I want to do this right. I want to date you, Grace, court you properly, take you to dinners and movies and walk with you in the park when I'm strong enough. I want to earn your love, not have it bound by legal obligations and desperate circumstances. Grace stared at him, tears spilling over. You want to date me? I've fallen in love with you, Christopher said simply. Somewhere between the poetry, readings, and the terrible hospital, food and the way you hold my hand during the hard moments, I've fallen completely, irrevocably in love with you. But you deserve a choice. A real choice. Not one forced by debt and dying wishes. Christopher, Grace whispered, I chose you weeks ago. I chose you when you woke up and looked at me like I was someone worth seeing. I chose you when you asked about my dreams instead of just taking what you needed. I chose you every day since then. Then choose me again, he said. When I'm better, when we're both free, choose me because you want to, not because you have to. They dissolved the contract marriage. Christopher's recovery continued, slow but steady. He underwent additional treatment, this time with hope instead of resignation. Grace continued her nursing work. But now she looked forward to her off hours, to the time she spent with Christopher as he regained his strength. 6 months after that first hospital ceremony, Christopher took Grace to dinner. He was thinner than he'd been before the illness, but there was life in his eyes, purpose in his movements. He'd stepped back from the Hayes Corporation, putting managers in place and choosing a different path for himself. I want to start a foundation, he told her over candlelight, for families dealing with medical debt, so no one else has to make the choice you made, marrying a stranger out of desperation. That sounds wonderful, Grace said, her heart swelling. I want you to help me run it, Christopher continued. Your insight, your compassion, that's what it needs. That's what I need. 1 year after the original ceremony, they married again. This time, Christopher was standing, strong and healthy. Margaret cried openly, something Grace had never seen. Dr. Thornton was there, marveling at his miracle patient. Grace's mother was there, too, healthy after her surgery, holding her daughter close. You saved us both, she whispered. But it was Christopher who had saved Grace in all the ways that mattered. He'd seen her, truly seen her when she'd felt invisible. He'd chosen her when he had every reason to retreat into his own struggle. As they exchanged vows this time, both of them fully present, fully choosing each other, Grace thought about that day in the hospital room. She'd agreed to marry a dying man for money, to be a wife in name only for 3 short months. Instead, she'd found the love of her life. They both had been dying in their own ways. Christopher from cancer, Grace from the crushing weight of impossible circumstances. But together, they'd found healing, found hope, found a future neither had dared to imagine. Sometimes the most unlikely beginnings lead to the most beautiful endings. Sometimes what looks like an ending is really just the start of everything that matters. And sometimes, love is the miracle that brings us back to life.